Good morning. Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, Southwestern University. I am so excited to be here. I'm also excited to tell you a little bit about our first speaker, Debra Haffner. Reverend Haffner is the co-founder and current president of the Religious Institute on Sexual Morality, Justice, and Healing. The Religious Institute is a one-of-a-kind national leadership organization working at the intersection of sexuality and religion. Reverend Haffner and her staff support faith organizations on sexuality issues and reproductive and sexual health organizations on religious issues and guidance. This organization connects and supports a network of over 6,000 faith leaders who are committed to sexual justice. Prior to her work with the Religious Institute, Reverend Haffner was the CEO of SIECUS. SIECUS is the United States' leading sexuality education organization. In her 12-year tenure as the CEO of SIECUS, the organization, she helped shape that organization into the prominent and influential one that it is today. She is also currently the endorsed community minister to the Unitarian Church in Westport, Connecticut. She has been married for 30 years and has a 27-year-old daughter and a 19-year-old son. Reverend Haffner has a master's degree in divinity, another master's degree in public health, and an honorary doctorate in public service from Widener University. She has been a sexuality educator for 37 years. She is the author of 6 books and scores of articles, monographs, and is the co-author of a college sexuality textbook that probably starts good conversations when the plumber sees it. One of her books, titled From Diapers to Dating, is actually how I was so fortunate to first come in contact with her wisdom and guidance. From Diapers to Dating is an award-winning book for parents on how to talk with our kids about sex, including information on what's normal, what's not, and how to support your child's healthy sexual development throughout their lives. All of Debra's books will be for sale later, but if you're a parent, I really especially encourage you to make sure that you get a copy of From Diapers to Dating. Helping bridge the gap between religion and sexuality is the focus of Reverend Haffner's talk today, and I'll let my last words be a quote from her on this. Sexuality education is a religious issue. We have a commitment to helping young people develop a moral conscience, including an ability to make healthy decisions. We have a religious commitment to truth-telling, which means that people should have full and accurate information, not biased and censored information. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Haffner to the podium.
Good morning. Okay, I'm a preacher, you've got to do better. Good morning. Much better. It is a pleasure to be here today at Southwestern University, and what an honor to be sharing today with Tracy and Dan and Pam and Debbie. I think we are in for a very exciting day. When people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them, whether I'm on an airplane or at a cocktail party, well, I'm a minister and a sexologist. And then someone laughs. See, because what it is people view those terms as oxymorons, sort of like jumbo shrimp, words that aren't supposed to go together. But our sexuality and our spirituality are intimately connected. And what I'd like to tell people is that at its foundation, my work first in the sexual and reproductive health field, and now my work as a minister, share a common moral vision to teach people how to treat each other with love and dignity and respect. You all know that in 2013, sexuality is a central part of life for all of us. Regardless of how old you are, regardless of your religion or your sexual orientation or your gender identity or your marital status or your political party, whether you identify as liberal or conservative or middle of the road, sexuality is a central part of your life. It's about how we feel about our bodies. It's about how we relate to our parents, our friends, our children, our partners. It's about the movies and the TV we watch, the songs on the radio. It's even about the news. Just think about the last few weeks of news. From the 40th anniversary last week of Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court taking on new cases on marriage equality, to President Obama's amazing line last week of Selma and Seneca Falls and Stonewall. Sexuality issues are in the news and surround us almost every day. Surround us both in our private and in our public lives. And what my task is today is to talk about how sexuality is intimately connected with our spirituality and our religious upbringing. As I began my journey to ministry from my prior career as a sex educator, I kept wondering, how is it that for so long, faith communities ignored the critical sexual needs of the people they were serving? Most of us in this room received negative or conflicting messages about sexuality from what I call our cradle religion, the religion of our childhood and adolescence. I describe cradle religion as the native religious language you grew up with from the time you were probably 0 to about 8 or 9. I grew up in a Jewish family. My husband grew up in a Roman Catholic family. Those are our hardwired messages. If we were on a plane and that plane was going down, I am quite certain I would say a Shema. He would say a Hail Mary. Neither of us would talk about the Unitarian principles and practices. Now, it's very fascinating. I cannot see you at all, okay? You are all completely in the dark. But I want you to look around, okay, at this question, which is, I would like those of you who grew up in a religion that taught you that your sexuality was a blessing, that your sexuality was sacred, that God was pleased to give you your sexuality. Would you raise your hands? So not so many, right? A few. And if I do this, I can actually see you. How many of you grew up in a religion that taught you that your sexuality was bad, your body was not as good as your soul, that you had feelings that needed to be confessed, that this was something we needed to overcome? Okay, look at that. Look around. And how many of you are going, I don't think we ever talked about this at all? Okay. And so that's what happens, is few of us have actually grown up in communities that teach us our sexuality is a gift. And despite the fact that some of us did, most people in America assume that religion teaches a negative view of sexuality, that it is the religious right or the Tea Party who speaks for religion on a broad range of sexual justice issues, and that people of faith are opposed to such issues as sexuality education, women's right to abortion, or even women's right to family planning, and the full inclusion of LGBTQ persons. So today, I'm going to share with you a different point of view. I want to talk to you today about what I call the gospel of sexuality and religion. The word gospel, as some of you know, means the good news in Greek. And I believe there is good news about a growing movement, a growing understanding to help us celebrate our sexuality as part of creation and towards a progressive religious vision of inclusiveness. A movement that will provide a clear alternative to the right as the voice of religion and sexuality in the public square, and a movement which will make every congregation a sexually healthy and responsible faith community. More than 6,000 religious leaders from more than 70 faith traditions are part of the network of my organization, the Religious Institute, and tens of thousands of others are working to promote sexuality education and sexual rights in their own denomination, and I'll return to that in a little while. Now, I understand if some of you are feeling a little skeptical. In my work, I've met many people who have decided that their cradle religion or their adopted religion is no longer adequate for the issues that they face in their life. I think Dan Savage may have something to say about that in a little bit. But for example, many gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender persons have not only left the religious homes of their youth, but they have turned their back on all religion because of the negative treatment or negative messages they have received. President of Starr King Seminary and Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker has labeled this a religious impasse. She says that when we have such moments, we have three choices. We can hold onto our religious beliefs and deny our own experience. We can hold onto our experience and walk away from all religion. Or, she says, we can become theologians. What she means is that it is in those moments that we must choose to search more deeply for our own answers, our own truths. Let me tell you a little bit more about my own faith journey on these issues. I began seminary very part-time in 1996 during a sabbatical from my position at the Sex Information and Education Council of the U.S. Growing up in a secular Jewish household, I had very little exposure to the Hebrew Bible and none at all to the New Testament. In Sunday school, we never seemed to get beyond Genesis and Exodus, and I am quite certain that my liberal parents would have been happier to have found pornography in my bedroom than a copy of the Christian scripture. When my seminary professors suggested that we try to read the passages in the Bible as if we were reading them for the first time, I'm pretty sure I was the only one in the class who was. But I also know at that time in 1996, I was reading the Bible first as a sexologist, not as a religious scholar, and I was frankly amazed at what I found. Now, like most people, I believed that the Bible only had two primary messages about sexuality. Don't do it. And if you were going to do it, sex was only for procreation. How far that is from the truth. The Bible actually begins with an affirmation of humans as sexual beings. If I take you to the first chapter of Genesis, it says, God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. And then God speaks to those new humans for the first time. The very first thing that God says to people is, go have sex. Be fruitful and multiply. Right? That's what that means, right? And then we see the second chapter of creation, which is an alternative story, and God is unhappy for the first time because God recognizes that it is not good for man to be alone, and God sets out to find Adam a companion. And then comes a passageway which in my mind always seems like the mid-1970s Saturday Night Live skit. So think about John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. And John Belushi is God, and he is bringing each of the animals forward to Adam and suggesting it as a companion. You got it? So the cow, not so much. The shrimp, I don't think so. The whale, all right. And the text says he goes through all of them, and Adam rejects them all, naming them, but not finding what God is looking for Adam. And it is only then that God puts Adam to sleep to create woman. The centrality of sexuality is emphasized in the last lines of Genesis 2. Hence, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. The goal of union is sexual pleasure. Procreation is never mentioned in the second chapter of Genesis. So if we put Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 next to each other, side by side, those first two texts of the Bible emphasize that men and women are equal, that we need companions and helpers and lovers in life, that sexuality is both procreative and recreative, and they underscore that God is pleased to offer us this gift. Did you learn that in Sunday school? My latest book, which will also be for sale today, is called Meditations on the Good News, Reading the Bible for Today. and it explores how the Bible can be inspirational to us today. Even if you think it has nothing to offer you, or if you are one of the increasing number of people who identify as a nun, that's N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, when it comes to religion. And what I want to tell you is that sex-positive message continues through the Hebrew Bible, followed by the radical love and inclusion messages of the New Testament. If you have not read the Bible in a long time, I encourage you, take another look. Genesis, for example, is a fascinating soap opera of 4 generations of a very dysfunctional family. Kind of like the Housewives of Atlanta of its time. Sexual intrigue features broadly through Genesis. There are stories of romantic love, love at first sight, infertility, marrying the wrong sister, sex with your dead brother's wife, aphrodisiacs, polyamory, and the negative part, sex killings, rape, sexual harassment. Other Hebrew Bible texts include negative statements about celibacy, multiple sexual and family relationships, and then the very erotic poetry of the Song of Songs. There are loving relationships celebrated between 2 men and 2 women, although we don't know whether they were acted on sexually. In mourning, for example, the death of his beloved Jonathan in 2 Samuel, David says, "Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of all women." Ruth's pledge to Naomi, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God," is ironically most often read where? At heterosexual Christian weddings as an example of a marriage covenant. Indeed, it was a covenant of a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law, a relationship that then involved tricking a man into sex so the mother-in-law could have a new baby to raise. I was once down south, and this woman raised her hand at this point and said, "I don't know what Bible you're reading." Honest, it's in there. These sexual messages continue into the Second Testament. In the first letter to Corinthians, Paul addresses 13 of the 36 topics that we believe should be included in sex education, including cautioning husbands and wives not to deny each other sex except for agreed-upon periods of time. If you read the text, Jesus welcomes the most marginalized people of his day. The woman who bathes his feet with oil and caresses them with her hair during a dinner party. The Samaritan woman at the well with the multiple husbands and lovers to whom he reveals his message, but whom he does not condemn. To the woman he refuses to condemn for sex outside of marriage, challenging the men of the town, "Let anyone who is without sin throw the first stone at her," and they all leave. To the eunuchs who received Jesus' blessings and commission in the books of Acts. In response to the question, what would Jesus do about people who are gay today, it is clear to me that he would welcome them, just as he did those who were the other in his time, the impoverished, the leper, the Samaritan. And despite what you may have heard from the Southern Baptist Convention, he welcomed women as his apostles, as his disciples, and as his teachers. Indeed, I believe that the Hebrew and Christian scriptures embrace a view of sexuality that is very close to most Americans. That our sexuality is a wonderful part of life, that our bodies are wonderful, that there are many forms of blessed relationship, that all people have dignity and worth, and that our sexuality must be exercised wisely so it is not a source of pain or an abuse of power. Most Americans believe in adult privacy on our most private sexual decisions. About 2 decades ago, there was a full-page ad in the New York Times that showed a couple in bed of indeterminate sexes, neither of whom had on a wedding band. The tagline on the ad said, "Who you sleep with is your business. How you sleep is yours. Call 1-800-MATTRESS." And when I called 1-800-MATTRESS to talk to the marketing director, and this was 20 years ago, I said, "Did you field test that?" And he said that they did, and people got it. That people want and support privacy. Now, while I'm here down in Texas, I want to address one other misconception about the Bible. You perhaps have heard people say that the Bible teaches us that God's intention for marriage is one man, one woman. The Bible, written in the context of its historical time, does not include that definition. Indeed, in the Hebrew Bible, the biblical model for marriage is most often polygamy. All of the heroes of the Hebrew Bible, except for one, for Isaac, all of the heroes have multiple wives or lovers. Jacob, the father of the tribes of Israel, has 2 wives and 2 concubines. The book of Kings tells us that Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, kind of the Wilt Chamberlain of his day. King David, in comparison, you can count, has a measly 21 wives in the book. And for those who say, well, that's the Old Testament, we can remind them that although Jesus in the gospel forbids divorce, almost all Protestant denominations now permit it for their laity and their clergy. Now, I want to be very clear. There are clearly biblical texts that conflict with our contemporary ethical insights, and that's where we need to be theologians. For example, texts that condone slavery, texts that regard women as property, forbid sex with menstruating women, equate disease with divine retribution, are no longer regarded as authoritative by even the most conservative religious communities. Yet, the 4 to 7, what we call the clobber texts on same-sex sexual behavior, depending on how you're counting, those 4 texts are used to exclude or attack gay and lesbian and transgender people, even though, and I actually did the math, they represent less than 0.003% of the verses in Scripture. And even though they do not address modern understandings of sexual orientation and gender identity as we understand them today. But even more important than that, relying on individual verses ignores the overarching message of Scripture to welcome the stranger, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and to view all people as created in God's image. When Jesus is asked in each of the 3 Gospels which commandment is the first of all, you remember what Jesus said? Love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. And the second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. We need to be theologians. Becoming a theologian also means moving from an act-centered sexual morality, often presented by faith communities, to one that is based on personal relationship. Too many of us were raised to believe that religion says that certain sexual acts or certain sexual relationships are sinful. Some of you learned from your religion that abortion is wrong, or homosexuality is wrong, or masturbation is wrong, or sex outside of marriage, or sex for pleasure is wrong. Some of you even grew up in a religion that taught that even your sexual thoughts were immoral and needing to be confessed. Several years ago, a priest was writing about confessions in the New York Times, and he said when he was a boy and in the confessional, the priest used to say to him, "My son, have you entertained impure thoughts?" He wrote he was always tempted to say, "Well, no, Father, they entertain me." So we need a new paradigm for sexual ethics. We need to say it is relationships, not acts, that are important. The Religious Institute's founding document, the Religious Declaration on Sexual Morality, Justice, and Healing, calls for relationships that are loving, just, mutual, committed, honest, and pleasurable. It says that a wedding band cannot be the sole criteria for a moral sexual relationship, but instead calls for an ethic that accepts no double standards and applies to all people without regard to sex, gender, color, age, bodily condition, marital status, or sexual orientation. I like to define my own theology as incarnational. In this room, we may differ about our beliefs in God, or indeed whether there is a God or what is larger than we are, or how to describe the sacred. But I think most of you will agree with me that when we are at our very best, How we treat each other is the expression of the divine on earth. If there is a God, then surely the route to knowing that God is through our own relationships. And surely in the vulnerability of our sexual relationships, we have the opportunity to know the divine in ways that do not exist in other relationships. You surely have heard about original sin, St. Augustine's 4th century concept, which says that because we are born through sex, we each carry sin in our lives. But if we are to be theologians, we must counter that concept. I like to talk more and more about expanding Father Matthew Fox's concept of original blessing, more explicitly addressing the sexual element of our birth. How joyful it is that each of us is born from a passionate act, hopefully an act in love. That the miracle of our birth, the miracle of our life, begins with the miracle of our sexuality. How radically different the world would be if original blessing was the historical message of our religious community. But I think it is also important that we remember there is a brokenness that so many of us have experienced or continue to experience about our sexuality, a brokenness that is often suffered in silence. Most of us carry within ourselves a dark box about our sexuality, a box that has fear and guilt and shame and misinformation and a history of negative sexual experiences. There is a dark side of sexuality: abuse, violence, rape, morbidity, exploitation, that also must be given voice on a day like this. Many of us in this room still struggle with these issues. Some of us were sexually abused as children. Some of us have been forced to have sex against our will. Some of us are struggling today in abusive relationships or with a history of abusive relationships. Some of us struggle with how to improve sex and intimacy, and some of us have given up on love and sex completely. Healing is often a first step towards sexual justice, as many of those who fight the most vociferously against our rights are those who are most broken, most frightened by their own sexuality. My ministry is also about sexual justice. Faith communities must work for sexual justice, both within the faith communities and society at large. The Religious Institute calls for the full inclusion of women and LGBT persons, including ordination and marriage equality. Sexuality education in schools, congregations, seminaries, and community settings, and a faith-based commitment to sexual and reproductive rights, including access to voluntary contraception, abortion, and HIV, STD prevention and treatment. The fact is, and you know this, during the past 30 years, every denomination, except perhaps the Unitarian Universalists, has been a sexual battleground, debating whether gays and lesbians or even women can be ordained, whether they can serve higher office, whether same-sex couples can be married, whether abortion can be a moral decision. In recent years, we've seen struggles in almost every Protestant denomination: the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the United Methodist Church, but we're winning. Conservative Jews 2 years ago began to openly ordain gay and lesbian rabbis. This past summer, the Episcopal Church began writing ceremonies for same-sex blessings. The Evangelical Lutheran Church now allows out-coupled gay and lesbian clergy. The Presbyterian Church voted 2 years ago that all of the U.S. presbyteries can now ordain clergy regardless of sexual orientation. 4 denominations now require sexual health training for all of their future clergy. Unfortunately, LGBT issues is still largely ignored by most denominations. The B's and the T's in particular need much attention. These changes in religious institutions are reflective of a more positive attitude in society as a whole, and at least some positive changes on laws. Almost 9 in 10 Americans now believe that gays and lesbians should have equal employment opportunities, up from 56% just 20 years ago. 63% of Americans, according to a poll last week, believe that Roe versus Wade should be upheld. A solid majority, more than 60% of Americans, support marriage or civil unions for same-sex couples up from 10% in 1996. Even 4 in 10 evangelical Christians support the right to long-term committed same-sex couples to such rights as hospital visits and inheritance. A remarkable 9 states now have legal marriage equality, with Illinois and Rhode Island not far behind. Our voices, your voices for full inclusion have made a difference. As people of faith, I am fond of saying we can no longer allow the religious right to be the voice of religion and sexuality in the public square. As people of faith, we must reclaim the Bible, the family, the church, the synagogue, the mosque. Indeed, for those of us who are theists, we must reclaim God from those on the right who claim to own them. It is time, as Reverend Al Sharpton, I don't usually quote him, but as Reverend Al Sharpton said several years ago, it is time for the Christian right to meet the right Christians. And I will add the right Jews, right Muslims, Buddhists, right pagans, and right Unitarians. It is also, however, time for us to stand up to the erotophobia of those religious leaders who call themselves progressive but are either silent or hostile on sexual justice issues. Too many so-called Christian progressive call on religious bodies, this is a quote from one, to avoid the hot-button issues of abortion and gay marriage. What these leaders, who are concerned primarily with ameliorating poverty, fail to understand is that there is a connection between economic justice and sexual justice. It is poor women who don't have health insurance to cover contraception. It is poor women who have the highest unintended pregnancy rates. It is poor women who wait the longest to have abortion and who are most likely to be affected by restrictions or abortion bans, or those who would take contraception out of the American Care Act. It is poor gay couples who are denied benefits like life insurance or legal assistance, where wealthier ones can purchase those services from private attorneys. It is poor transgender persons who turn to unsafe street drugs when they have no access to insurance to pay for transitioning assistance. Poverty, racism, sexism, and homophobia are interconnected at their core, and as people of faith who are concerned with the least of these, our commitment to sexual justice must be part of it. These so-called progressive leaders have been reluctant to recognize media reports every few years about the premature death of the religious right, notwithstanding that the sexual issues are the mainstay issues of the organized right. A few years ago, religious leaders cautioned emerging evangelicals to stop being so concerned about the environment because they were diverting attention on, quote, this is a quote, from the great moral issue of our time, notably the sanctity of human life, the integrity of marriage, and the teaching of sexual abstinence and morality to our children. Now, I'm guessing most of you, like me, despite my commitment to these issues, do not think that those are moral issues surpassing poverty, homelessness, war, hunger, global warming, the Congo, Syria, and so on. But as long as those issues remain front and center for the religious right, they must be core policy and political issues for us as well. As Reverend Barry Lynn, the president of Americans United, has written, the goals of Christ and the goals of the religious right have very little in common. Christ did not spend his time trying to forge a faith-based government. He did not obsess over the sexual habits of people. Were he here today, I find it inconceivable that Christ would parade in front of an abortion clinic screaming at teenage girls, or picket a gay man's funeral hoisting a sign with a hateful homophobic message. Or, as just a few weeks ago, picketing the funerals of the children in Sandy Hook, 15 miles from my home, as Westboro threatened to do last month because we have marriage equality in Connecticut. It may not be obvious on face values, but sexual issues are moral values that demand a progressive religious response. Our theological commitment to truth-telling and the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, means we must oppose abstinence only until marriage education. Our understanding that it is because life is so precious, we must do everything possible to make sure it is not created carelessly, and that means we must support contraception and sex education. Our commitment to the moral agency of all people, including the moral agency of women, means that we must articulate that abortion is always a moral decision and that each woman must have the right to make that decision without governmental interference. Our theological commitment to the dignity and worth of all persons and our understanding that sexual and gender diversity is part of God's blessing to us means we must stand up for the full inclusion of GLBTQ persons. We must articulate that the sin is never sex, but sexual exploitation. The sin is not homosexuality, but homophobia, the denigration of our neighbors because they are physically and emotionally attracted to people of the same sex or people of both sexes. The sin is heterosexism, the presumption that heterosexuality is normative and therefore morally superior. The sin is forcing people to deny their God-given gift of their sexuality and to suffer trying to live their lives in a way antithetical to who they are. The sin is violence and discrimination against women and LGBT persons and denial of their civil rights. The sin is when any of us, whether we are straight or gay and lesbian or bisexual, whether we violate our commitments to our partners and we hurt our families, as we see again and again and again in the cases of public figures, from Arnold Schwarzenegger to John Edwards to Anthony Weiner, etc. The sin is making sexual decisions that hurt ourselves and hurt others. We must also say that freedom of religion means that government cannot privilege the teachings of one religion over another. There is no single religious voice that can speak for all faith traditions on moral issues of pregnancy, abortion, marriage equality, emergency contraception, stem cell research, and so on. America understands that government cannot take a side on religious difference. See, we must become theologians. We are called in Hebrew to kum olam, to save the world, to heal the brokenness that so many suffer around unintended pregnancies, coerced and exploitive sexual experiences, attacks on bodily integrity, soul-numbing denial of one's sexual or gender identity, and violence against women and children and sexual minorities. Martin Luther King Jr., whose birthday we just celebrated, says, "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." We know that as long as adolescents are denied the right to information, that as long as the right and ability to make a decision about pregnancy is not secured, that as long as people are denied the right to love each other and make lifelong public commitments, then none of us are secure in our sexual rights. Martin Luther King Jr. liked to quote Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I believe that despite the struggles going on in many of our faith communities, that ultimately all people of faith will embrace the idea that we are all God's children, and that our sexuality in all its stunning diversity is part of our birthright. To return to Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. It's not just about sex. It's not just about our procreative possibilities. It's about our call to bring our gifts and talents to the world. It is the call to each of us to be co-creators with God of a world characterized by justice, integrity, and right relations. It is a call to heal a world broken by poverty, discrimination, preventable disease, and injustice. The Talmud says, in the world to come, each of us will be called to account for all the good things God put on earth which we refuse to enjoy. In the words of the poet, We are the change we want to see in the world. We are the ones we have been waiting for. The religious declaration ends, God rejoices when we celebrate our sexuality with holiness and integrity. And so may it be in your lives, in the lives of those you love, in the lives of your children, and in your grandchildren. May our vision of a world where sexuality is celebrated with holiness and integrity be fruitful and multiply. Blessings to you all.
Test? Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right. So my question is that a lot of the stuff that we see is very sex negative, such as rape and things like that, and that's sort of the message that is spread out. So how do we all here as citizens spread out this sex positive message that you are advocating?
So you're here, so thank you. And you take good notes the rest of the day. I think it's by talking. Those of us who are parents, the reason I wrote books for parents is because I really believe it starts in the home, and that we create an atmosphere. I think for those of you who are students, it's getting involved and educating your peers. I think it's being an effective citizen, so when you see stuff either in Congress, and by my goodness, I'm not supposed to lobby, but Congress has lots of things they could use to hear from you on in sex-positive ways. It's writing to the media when they do well, and it's also writing to the media when they do badly. It's taking a stand about what we want to see and what we don't want to see. And then it's one-on-one. You know, one of the things I think all of us who are here today think when we do our sexual enrichment talks, people all the time say, what's the one thing you can tell me to be a better lover? You know, what's the one thing everybody needs to know? As if there's a magic trick. The answer is the one thing everyone needs to know is how to talk about sex. So start with your most intimates. Start with the person who you are romantically involved with, or the people you might be romantically involved with. Begin the conversation.
Thank you.
I'm curious as to
Where are you?
why sexual abuse and exploitation seems so... Sorry. I'm curious as to...
Oh, and I can see you now.
as to why sexual abuse and exploitation seems so prevalent, especially of young people in the clergy. Your thoughts on that?
Okay. So the clergy sexual abuse crisis, first of all, is actually not predominantly aimed at children. If we look across denominations, it's actually clergy misusing their power with adults. The clergy sexual crisis in the Catholic Church was largely about male priests abusing, not boy children, although that's gotten more of the news, but they're actually more female children. I think clergy need to be trained in two things. One is the effective use of power and to understand what are appropriate boundaries. But most clergy in this country do not receive any education about sexuality. I went to 2 different seminaries for my training. Neither of them talked about sexuality. We would never have been able to graduate if we hadn't learned to talk about death and dying. but they let us out without knowing anything about sex. So one of the things my organization, the Religious Institute, has been doing is we have been working both with seminaries and denominations since 2006. And 4 denominations now require clergy to get sexual health training. We're working with an additional 5. We only found 1 seminary in the entire United States that required a sexuality education class for graduation, and that includes training around boundaries and handling your sexual attractions. There are now 22 of them that meet our criteria for a sexually healthy and responsible seminary. So it is changing, but it's changing slowly. And the important thing on this is breaking the silence. We need to, any of you who are abused, the fact is that if you go back to the Bible is full of stories where people are both raped and sexually exploited. There's nothing new about this. What we need to do is teach people that their sexuality is a gift, but it has to be exercised responsibly and with respect.
On the issue of abortion, I think all Americans need to be reminded that in 2006, South Dakota, which is not a flaming liberal state, they had a high turnout vote on a law the legislature had passed that would have prohibited all abortions. That law was defeated by almost a 60% vote of the South Dakota citizens, the big turnout. 2 years later, they passed another law which included the exceptions for rape, incest, and health of the mother. That law also was put before the citizens of South Dakota and defeated by almost a 60% vote. So we can talk all we want about polls, but you've got a conservative state that I think has said in the strongest possible way, we want abortion available.
And what people, thank you, and there were personhood amendments in the last couple of years in Mississippi, which is also not one of our more radical states, which got roundly defeated. You're all from Texas? Yeah? You know you have a problem here, right? And part of that problem, as I understand it, is that Planned Parenthoods have been defunded from, am I right? Yes, still? Yeah, so to the man back here says, what do we do about this? So your voices need to make a difference. I cannot believe, I started in this field when I was 18 years old. I've just had my 58th birthday. I now say I am a postmenopausal woman for choice. I never would have believed that I would be fighting for access to birth control in 2013. We need to say 98% of sexually active Americans use birth control methods. 98% of Roman Catholic women who are sexually active in a heterosexual relationship use birth control methods. So our voices, this is why I think the work that I'm so excited about, the work that I do with religious leaders all over the country, but you as people of faith have an important role, and I think maybe I'll make this as my last pitch, which is if you would like to join with us, we have a national network called the Faithful Voices Network. We will keep you informed of what's going on nationally and in your state. If during the coffee break you give me a piece of paper with your name and address or your card, I would be happy to have you become part of us. In fact, I'd be thrilled to have you become part of us because our voices can make a difference, and we need to say as people of faith, we support individual sexual rights, and that includes access to reproductive justice, that includes the full inclusion of women, and that includes the full inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersexual, and our allies. We need to be that voice of faith in the public square. Thank you so much, and blessings on what's going to be a great day.